What survives in horology and who decides that? That's the question that frames this conversation with host of Fifth Wrist Radio and a central voice behind its independent thinking format. Roman represents a different kind of authority in the watch world. An authority that is grounded not in institutions but in knowledge. Fifth Wrist operates outside traditional structures. No brand sponsorship, no institutional backing, just a global community built around conversation, around research and curiosity. And at the center of it, Roman focuses on something often overlooked: the role of books, of scholarship, and long-term thinking in shaping what becomes watch history. In this episode, we explore knowledge as power, how books, research, and serious study influence which brands, makers, and references are remembered and which are forgotten. We discuss how scholarship becomes the foundation for legitimacy, even in a market increasingly driven by speed, by visuals, and short-form content. We also talk about media, from forums to podcasts to Instagram. The ecosystem of horological discourse has changed dramatically. So does independent media today still protect substance from hype? Or we simply are producing more content faster without deepening understanding? This is a conversation about memory, about preservation, and about the quiet role of those who read, who compare and question, not to own watches, but to understand them. So stay with us, because in horology, the most powerful collections are not always worn, sometimes they are written. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode at Watches and Politics, where I have the utmost pleasure to being together with Roman from the Fifth Wrist. And Roman has been in the industry, has been with the people, has contributed to what we're doing here right now today, to the education of enthusiasts on horology, with his work, with his podcast, with his wisdom. He has educated many of us on books about horology, on knowledge, and the continuation of the horological wisdom. I'm very, very happy to have Roman with me today. Roman, welcome to Watches and Politics.
Hi, Eddie. Thank you. That was an astonishingly kind introduction. So thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Well, as we talked many times, we are here all about education. So your work is really very important, and I'm happy to have this conversation with you. But one thing that I want to start with is, among all your reading and all your work, what is the first things that come to your mind when you hear Watches and Politics? Except of Eddie and this podcast, what other things come to your mind?
Well, obviously, this podcast is the thing that we're in the right area. That's a really interesting question. I mean, the way I see the first things when you say Watches and Politics, the images that my mind conjures up are Napoleon Bonaparte and Breguets. Then we have what would be a good one? The Vulcain cricket watches with American presidents, staying on American presidents, the often performative way American presidents wear affordable watches in office and highly unaffordable watches as soon as they leave office. Bill Clinton's a classic example, but there are any others. And also, I guess, Winston Churchill with his turnip Breguet pocket watch as well. So I think watches have been kind of instrumental in politics and the way conquest gets shaped and all of that. It's a very complex dynamic, shall we say.
And I can't agree more. I mean, that's the reason why I decided to do this project, is because that's such a complex dynamic, as you put it. But let's know a little bit more about Roman. So you describe yourself as a horological history nerd and a collector of horological
horological books, which is not something that we usually see. And as you can see on my bag, I have some horological books as well. But at what point did you realize that collecting knowledge can be just as important as collecting watches?
Very early. I mean, my pathway into watch collecting has been a little bit sort of sideways. I got really interested in navigation. So, and in particular how, the longitude problem was solved, which is, the clockmaker John Harrison, how they managed to map out the pathways, and how British Empire essentially got built by this tiny little island colonizing the world by essentially having really precise ways of finding where they are on the globe. And I started doing some reading, and I was reading about the English clockmakers, John Harrison I started with, and then I was seeing who else was active in kind of this contemporaries or slightly later, and I discovered the French horologists like Ferdinand Berthoud or Leroy, and I found, and Breguet was also a clockmaker to the king. And I found a book by George Daniels called The Art of Breguet. And it was published in 1975, was a really detailed but really great way to learn about Breguet. And so I got into that, and then I sort of was wondering who George Daniels was. And then I looked up that George Daniels was a watchmaker in his own right, making incredible watches by hand. And then I was lost to the world of independent horology. But the accumulation of knowledge was very early. Very quickly I got into books, and also because books were much more affordable than watches or clocks, right? So if you can't buy a Breguet watch, you buy a book about Breguet, and that's precious enough, and then you kind of go down that rabbit hole. So very early on.
Well, that's my journey as well. I started with watch collecting and everything about horology through education, but that's because I like reading. I'm an academic by trade, so books were very important. But at the same time, with books, you can travel to the time when these were made,
Sure.
what they meant, and there are actually some amazing books that do an incredible job just digging in their archives and bringing to us what those archives tell us. And that is why I want this project to be about education, just so we can pass on the education to everyone that wants to learn it, without the necessity for planting the watch collecting bug in them,
Sure.
because that would be a problem. But let me ask you today, let me ask you that, what role then do books still play today in horology? Do you think they are still foundational, or are they slowly being replaced by podcast, Instagram, and online discourse maybe?
It's a great question. I'll tackle the second part of the question first. I don't think books are being replaced by the new media, shall we say, whether it's YouTube, watch podcasts, and I realize the irony of me saying this on your podcast and I have my own podcast, but in no way, these are complementary to the foundational bits of the book. So I don't see books being replaced for a number of reasons, right? So books are beautiful objects in their own, they have their own intrinsic value as an object, and a beautifully made book will always be a beautifully made book. So that's always a tangible thing. Books are also a good timestamp of the time that they're written, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but books, once they're published, they really become sort of a snapshot of time, of how people were thinking about the scholarship about a particular topic in that time. So that they also have that sort of side of things. And also books, particularly collectible books or books with interesting provenance, or signed books, or books that were given as gifts by their authors or by eminent makers, become sort of a tangible path through history as well, that you can trace an ownership of a special book through the author to whoever was given as a present or as a special token of appreciation. And so you can really travel through time with a book. The videos, YouTube, podcasts, all of that, with the online media, they're very good. They're complementary in a way, but they're not as permanent. So things get lost, things get edited, you know, media degrade, platforms disappear. So, you know, I came into this hobby through forums, and there are still a few forums around, but they're not really, you know, we can see how quickly forums got superseded by podcasts and everything else. So books are in some ways more permanent than the more recent, if you like, additions to the horological canon of information.
So, and this is, as you said, this is very interesting to speak about this in a podcast that
Sure.
that speaks about books and education and everything. And I just started a series where I am reviewing horological books as series number 3 of Watches and Politics. And there, what I do is I don't just take a book and then explain what it means. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give context, why it mattered at that time, what does it says, how does it look, who should read it, you know, what to expect from that and stuff like that. And I can't agree more with you that books are not being replaced, but now there is a need to synchronize visual media, social media, maybe some fast media with books or manuscripts. So, um, do you think then books still serve as a token of provenance associated with great makers or collectors?
Yes. Yeah, I really do. And what I find really interesting is I think the really not smart collectors, but really savvy collectors, when they get to a certain level of collecting, really start thinking about their legacy of their collections. Because, you know, all of us travel through time with the watches that we have. We are temporary custodians of those objects. You know,
Yes.
we will go, the collection, if you're lucky, you have children who will inherit it and look after it. What mostly happens is we enjoy these objects, then at some point the collection, big C or little c collection, gets dispersed out, right? And I think what very smart, thoughtful collectors early on realized was you need to capture this collection of your own in some kind of form that you pass your knowledge or your passion through time to future, aspirants to the horological canon. So, you know, and this starts very early, 1923, David Solomons becomes a Breguet collector, amasses an incredible collection of Breguet watches, writes a book because I think he realized I need to capture this. This was the Solomons collection. And that book is still relevant now, 103 years later, right? All the way, if we fast forward to a mutual friend of ours, Mitch Katz, who was an amazing, thoughtful collector, going strong with horological author now, but also, he wrote his collecting memoir, Time on My Hands, which everyone should read. It's a great book. So I think having your thoughts, feelings, reasons for collecting encapsulated in a book is a really good way to make sure your collection, inverted commas, whatever that is, travels through time. And so a bit of you travels through time, legacy-wise.
And, I would also argue that the same should happen with makers. All makers should have their own uh, autobiography, their own journey documented in such a way. And sometimes you read some books that are too technical. Sometimes you read some books that are too propagandistic. Like
Sure.
we have to be real. Sometimes there are marketing, but then there are books, as you mentioned, like our mutual friend Mitch, who you just need to read it because he and people that have written about their collections like him open their secrets, their insights for people to enjoy and to read and what they felt and all those kinds of things. I really think this is extremely important to also understand everything that is happening at that time that the book is written. You read about Mitch Cass, you can understand what his journey has been through, what his emotions with people that made those watches that he met, they went through, etc., etc. But I wanted to continue about not only books, but also scholarships and long-form research and how they shape what later becomes accepted as watch history. Sometimes we also read about marketing and stuff like that, but what about like long-term research, how that is important for makers and brands, so then it becomes watch history.
Yeah, so I mean, I think any author of a book on watches, a book that comes out in solid form, I think there is a stronger emphasis on fact checking. There's a stronger emphasis on getting things right, getting secondary sources, tertiary sources, backing them, because once it's printed and bound in covers, it's out there. I think the tendency for the more recent media is, whether it's long form writing, short form writing, Instagram post, but even in long term, the facts are always malleable, so you can write and edit, write and edit, write and edit in real time. Whereas in a book, there is that we have to get this as right as we can because it's going to haunt us if we don't, So I think the quality of information is higher just because the sunk costs into producing something like that is higher. So I think there is definitely a stronger, a much more durable sort of thing to facts. Now, facts do change with emerging scholarship. And that's why you have books, first edition. Sometimes the second edition comes out where there's a few pages of errata, or, they will say this has been updated with more recent scholarship. But there is still a conscious effort to get things more right, in a book form, which I really appreciate.
And same here. So Roman, you also seen that recently watch training schools and teaching programs are reducing. Recently in Pennsylvania, I think Rolex had a school. They are closing. I don't know if they're opening something in Dallas. I'm not sure that is the same thing. Anyway, but does this give books a bigger importance in terms of the transfer of horological knowledge for collectors, but maybe also for those that want to enter into watchmaking professionally?
Great question. So, I mean, I think yes. So I think the importance of a good book on watchmaking, let's take not to use a hackneyed phrase, but the Bible of watchmaking is the George Daniels book called Watchmaking, right? There's a reason why that book was written in 1981, I think, from memory, first edition. It's gone through a few iterations, but it's still in print now, and fifth edition. People still, if you talk to a lot of independent watchmakers, they'll either tell you they've read it or there's a well-thumbed copy on the bookshelf somewhere behind them in the workshop, right, covered with oily fingerprints. So that just goes to show you how important books are. But having said that, I think this is where new media can have a really complementary element to books, because one thing, if you're learning a trade or a mechanical skill, what I think is really important is if we can record video makers, if we can use video recordings of makers doing the tasks, doing the skills, that's really beneficial, because, you can't teach somebody how to hold a chisel without, you can draw an illustration, but it's really one thing to actually see the maker do it. So you can, if you're learning how to do it, you can see where their wrist is positioned, and, they can tell you, well, you do it till this shine, or you do it until this noise is coming off the lathe. There are some intangible things that video would be helpful, but I think books as reservoirs of knowledge, yeah, absolutely, really, really important. I think hugely important.
I believe that even F.P. Journe, he said that his entrance into doing his own things was through George Daniels's
Sure.
watchmaking book and many others, and I agree with you. But now let's go into your own work. So Fifth Wrist has positioned itself as an independent, community-driven space. Do you think that independent media today can still protect substance over hype, or has the economy become too fast and too market-driven?
I mean, I think I think the economy, it's big. It is harder and harder and harder to be, I guess, independent in whatever, whether you're independent watchmaker or independent podcaster. What we've made a really conscious effort when we started back in sort of 2019 or so, we started off as a sort of collection of friends, collectors, watchmakers, enthusiasts, if you like, who got sort of sick of the pay-for-play watch media, because a lot of watch media content is, paid for, just purely for the economics of it. Somebody has to pay the bills and it's usually advertisers. But once you get the money involved, once that, the wall is broken between editorial and advertorial, things get very murky. So we didn't want to be that. So from day one, we said, we're not going to have any commercial partners. This is not a money-making venture for us. There's no sponsored content. There's no sponsors. We just do it as something to do, to give back to this hobby that we all enjoy. So that's been our independence, but it's not a commercial venture for us. The advantage that has is, I run this independent thinking podcast. What I'm really interested in is independent horology, so makers who do stuff, or independent brands, but they have to be sort of independent, and also writers who write books and things. So I have the privilege. I only talk to who I want to talk to. I don't need to have a CEO of a brand just because they're releasing a blue dial version of their thing that they released last year is green, so I have to have them on. I can, so I have the luxury, or we have the luxury of just speaking to who we want to about things that really interest us. I do sympathize with watch media companies or entities who do need to do this as a commercial enterprise. So I do absolutely sympathize with the need to get ads or monetize the content somehow. What I would like to see, this is a personal thing, this is me speaking off the cuff, is I'd like to see a lot more independent voices, because what we've seen particularly more lately is a lot of the really good writers are leaving those commercial watch entities to set up on their own, and that's why you're seeing proliferations of Substacks and some kind of subscriber-based monetization to kind of maintain their independence, which I think it's a great potential model. It's harder, I would imagine, to make thing, but I think independence, that voice that you can trust in your ear or on your screen, in content, particularly describing these quite expensive objects that we buy as collectors, you want independent voice. I think is really important.
I think recently we have a lot of hype going on as well, and that
Oh
is,
yes,
which that is also because of some brands who maybe want to uh, push on
sure,
certain models, and that includes ambassadorial
sure.
sponsorship with celebrities, and that also includes pushing it through the watch media. As you said, I also sympathize with the people that, at the end of the day, they have to keep their lights on.
Sure.
But as much independent voices or content that we have there, as better. And now I'm seeing that a lot of people also focus on micro brands and at least try to give them some voice. So
Mm.
I think that is going on the right direction, especially now after the watchmaking hype has
Oh
calmed
yes,
down a little bit.
sure.
After COVID, we had all these um, people that found horology and wanted to become
Mm.
collectors. So that is winding down a little bit more, and now we can have maybe a little bit of more diehard enthusiasts. But in this um, in this hobby, in this um, industry, there's constantly some comparison, with the
Mm.
brands, the movements,
Sure.
the finishings, and then heritage and value. So, what makes a comparison meaningful rather than superficial for you?
So I think authenticity makes any comparison laughable or worthy of consideration. So if we take brand X, who resurrect a name, let's say somebody decides to resurrect John Harrison Watch Company, starts a name and says since 1653, what I'm making up the number, and puts a tagline, John Harrison Horology since 1653. That's laughable, right? Particularly if they start using this as a way to say, look, we've been here for 400 years. I mean, stuff like that is laughable. There are a few watch companies now, who have their tagline since 1753, and people playing at home could probably figure out who I'm talking about, or whatever, we've never, like, there are some things where you go, well, this is clearly ludicrous, and it doesn't stand up to any sort of scrutiny. So if companies start, if watch companies start comparing themselves on heritage, in inverted commas, that becomes very laughable, right? Again, companies that compare themselves on levels of hand finishing, if they don't do the hand finishing, also becomes laughable. Or companies that sort of say, every watch gets handmade by an old man in a valley de Joux overlooking the valley with the cows coming home, and they make 900,000 watches. That's not practical. So if we can remove the hype BS of it, those sort of comparisons are laughable, should be discounted. But there are sometimes comparisons worthwhile. So price point, I think, is an interesting way to compare watches, right? Again, if you say, if the brand is whatever, but if these two watches exist in the same price bracket, they should be broadly comparable on somewhere, right? So again, you start looking, is the value of company A's watch equivalent to the value of company B's watch? So I think those sort of comparisons are worthwhile of just thinking about as a collector in terms of value. And you can do that across any price level. Watch doesn't have to be $1 million. A watch can be $500, but if one is $500, but it's made of plastic and it's rubbish, but it has an influencer's name on it, versus something that's $500, but actually has some interesting design, some unusual feature, something that the makers, added into a stock standard thing, maybe that's a better one. So, so there are reasonable points of comparison where that becomes meaningful versus not.
And a lot of people, I don't know if you would agree, but a lot of people now maybe look on things maybe not always in a correct way. So like perfect finishing, like look at this finishing, but then it doesn't function as it should. Now, maybe sometimes we go too much into one particular thing that we forget, what is really important. Like again, the movement may be decorated, but then there is the dial was not well done or well interpreted. So beauty is also in the eyes of the beholder, and different people may like different things. But as you said, when they start comparing some things that are not there, then that becomes also too pushy for the collectors, I think.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. But also I think there is a degree of obfuscation, or there's a degree of, smoke and mirrors and mystique that brands and the Swiss watch industry has purposefully maintained, because that keeps the mystique of a Swissness, the watch of the value or whatever. So where I think things are changing is collectors, I think, with with internet and communities, micro communities and collector communities, there is a degree of democratization of knowledge. So more and more people are learning more and more, even superficially, so it's becoming harder to confuse, or at least put out really complete nonsense, right? So, and some watch companies learn that the hard way, if we use a recently rebranded watch company. We weren't, inspired by two brothers. We don't need to name. A few years ago, they came out with a fully in-house watch, fully in-house caliber, and then some eagle-eyed collectors said, hang on, that's not in-house. And we saw a company backpedal in real time. Oh, well, when we mean in-house, it's sort of, we're not in-house, but it's sort of we used another provider, and, the in-house, maybe you could see the company kind of backpedal, and that was really bad. And I think some in the industry should note and remember these lessons where, reputations are made over time, but lost very quickly. So, collectors are becoming a little bit more educated. And this is where scholarship comes into play, really important. The more you empower the consumer, the more it becomes harder to fool them, hopefully. So I think this is where you as a reader, you have to be in the right mind. If you're reading a book about watches, you need to have a clear lens, I guess, through which to view these things. So if I'm reading, Cecil Clutton's book on his collector's collection, that's a really fascinating history, 1965, I think it was, or something. He was writing with a particular thing of, he's narrating his own collection journey. He had this rule that he would only have 12 watches, and he's telling you about the watches that he's accumulated and why these 12 made the cut. Although he goes above 12, he breaks his own rule in his own book, which is great. Typical collector. We all set rules and go, this is the last one, no more. And, as soon as the wife or husband turns around, you go, oh, maybe I'll do one more. But that's a really fascinating thing of, I enjoyed that book because it put me, an interesting insight into a mind of another collector. Of how does a very discerning collector who could really have everything, how does he decide? What's his decision tree? You had a previous guest on your podcast, Gary Getz. He has this whole rubric of, patronage and I love Gary. That was a great episode. Again, fascinating discussion to figure out how do other people make decisions about stuff. So reading those kind of books, you learn about other collectors and their collecting philosophies as much as you learn about the watches. If I look at, then let's say we change tack. Let's say I look at a book by, I know the Patek Philippe Museum that they recently published this 2-volume book. I'm reading that I know this is a book produced by Patek Philippe. The underlying thing will be Patek Philippe Museum is amazing. Everyone should go. And by the way, everyone should own a Patek, because you don't own a Patek. You merely, hand it over to the next generation. You read it with this is an advertisement. The museum is important. I'm very grateful that the brand has the museum and they're accumulating important watches. But I know at some point, the way it's written, it's an advertorial for the Patek Philippe brand and museum. So I think as an educated reader, you just have to put yourself into, you don't believe everything you read, obviously, but you get as much out of these books as you can. And this is why you don't just read a book by one author. You don't just buy all the books by John Goldberger, for example. Great books they are, expensive, but great. You get John Goldberger's books, you get John Reardon's books if you want to learn about Patek, because John's books are fantastic. His podcast's amazing as well. His website's great. So you got to be a bit of a magpie and just cherry pick and accumulate knowledge. Be an educated reader as you are educating yourself about any sort of topic. So at least that's my approach.
And, that's also the approach. I guess that's my second approach. My first approach is just read whatever you can, because
Sure.
I just like reading.
Sure.
But
Yes.
I mentioned to you this before. The reason, for example, why I like Mitch's book is because he opens himself to the reader. It's not only about the watches. So, for example, let's say David Solomon's book about collecting brigades. I love it, but I love it for what those watches are and all those kinds of things.
Sure.
Whereas when collectors open up their personal train of thought, their personal emotions, I guess that's what intrigues me even more. And at the same time, there are and why not? I should maybe we can. I'm not sure that the executives of brands are going to listen to this interview, but if they do, you know, readers can actually understand when everything is marketing, advertisement, what is editorial and stuff. One of my favorite books of all time, horology books, is The World of Bashar and Constantine. Why is that? Is because there, yes, I read about Bashar and Constantine, but at the same time, I read about what the world looked like when they made those decisions. So what was written in philosophy, what philosophers were doing, what was happening in art, what was happening in politics, and that is beautiful.
Sure.
It doesn't scream, of course, marketing. It teaches you something instead of just uh, some some facts which may be right about that particular brand, but doesn't go beyond it. This hobby, I feel, is very personal and very personal touch. So maybe we should talk a little bit about the propaganda that some books are designed to make.
Sure. Sure.
What are your thoughts about books that are written? I call it propaganda because this is what is in politics, but that can be marketing.
Yeah,
That can
but
be.
it's the same. Yeah, look,
But it's like directly towards that.
Look, I mean, those books exist, so I look at them with a skeptical eye. Like I would look at any piece, not just in a book. Like I would read any article online. So if a book is produced by, actually, probably the best example is, I view books that are produced by brands about themselves the same way I view biographies of celebrities that are written as an authorized biography, right?
Okay.
So if something's an authorized biography, that means the subject had control over the content. So if you want to find out about watches or about celebrities or whatever, you read the unauthorized biography, because that's when the writer of the book goes and does research and they don't have to run the content past the subject. So it would be exactly the same by the brands. So if you want to read an unbiased version about Patek Philippe, maybe you don't necessarily buy the Nick Falk's book about Patek Philippe, although it's a great book, don't get me wrong. Nick does amazing research and it's a very well written book, but it's always going to be a sanitized version, or it's always going to give Patek Philippe a little bit more leeway towards importance and underplay other makers or in those areas. So just you got to be an educated sort of reader. Whenever time you read a book produced by a brand about themselves, just assume it might be correct, all the information, or the brand might be painting themselves in a little bit more light, or giving themselves a little bit more importance, or giving themselves a more primary role in something. So if you're reading about 1969 and the first automatic chronograph, there's 10 different companies that were going for it, and even to this day we don't know, inverted commas, whether it was Zenith, there was somebody else, or Breitling, it was, but every company will claim it. So if you read a thing that says we were the first chronograph, automatic chronograph, if it's Zenith, for example, they won't necessarily mention that Seiko had a prototype slightly before. They'll, so got to be a little bit skeptical. So propaganda, that's why propaganda works. That's why those companies are investing money in producing these glossy books and things, because that's how they establish their luxury status and keep themselves in particular spheres of collecting. Because it's like paid marketing, right? The more you invest in scholarship, the more you keep your brand up. And we definitely see that. Companies that have invested in scholarship and books being written about themselves are more collectible, and companies that haven't really struggle to maintain, heritage or their own importance in the collecting world. For
That
sure.
you touched a very, very important point, and that is because of scholarship that is doing that. And I might want to go deeper on that. The thing here that I find, like I'm in a crossroad, is as an independent researcher or a writer, you don't have that access to, for example, archives if the brand don't let you.
Sure.
So that's a shortcoming. But then there are brands that or makers that actually want to um, open themselves up to even things that are vulnerable. I love F.P. Journe, but the book about F.P. Journe, I find it that everybody that loves F.P. Journe must read it cover to cover, because that is where we know this guy is very extravagant and eccentric, and like F.P. Journe, he's everywhere. But then when you read that book, you see some of the vulnerabilities that that he has, maybe, or at least that's how I perceived. And I told you that I love The World of Vacheron Constantin, which is actually a brand publication, but at the same time, it included researchers who did research on different things, and books by Franco Coloni and Nick Fontes. So these are all interesting. I was wondering, would you mind sharing, for example, any of the books, branded or not branded, that you like most?
Sure. So, I mean, my interest is mainly in independent horology, but
Mhm.
as general brands, I think a really fantastic book, if you're somebody who's just wants to learn about watches in general, a book that I really like, and I'm just going to hold it up. I know we're visual, not a visual podcast, but you'll see it, which is the Wristwatch Handbook by Ryan Schmidt. I don't know if you've
Yes.
read this. So,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, good. So that's a fantastic book because Ryan, who I had the pleasure of speaking with my posture a long time ago, but Ryan purposefully wrote a book that was brand agnostic. So, so he had, I think, 600 photographs and 800 watches mentioned. He went out of his way to describe horological concepts, complications or whatever, but in a brand agnostic way. Those are my favorite types of books, where I go, I want to learn about watches in general. Let's say I want to learn about split chronographs. I don't necessarily want to read the Patek book on split chronographs. I want to read like a technical, not technical book that will give me the history of the thing, but that's not written by the brand. So those are kind of my favorite books in terms of kind of learning about context of watches and sort of history and how it was. The book I really like is by David Landis, Professor David Landis. It was Revolution in Time, rather. Fantastic book. Again, doesn't talk about brands, although he name drops George Daniels into it right towards the end, because he owned a George Daniels watch, so he's got to slide that in. So it's a little flex early on. It's an example of an early literary flex, shall we say? Page 300 and something. But books like that place watches into contexts, I really like. So because again, my journey, and I hate the word journey, but my journey into watch collecting was very much through navigation. So I like seeing watches in their kind of proper context, which is kind of a crossroads of history, technology, culture, right? And engineering, if you like, so there's lots of ways to kind of approach it. But I like seeing a watch. Let's see, if I'm reading about, marine chronometers. I mean, it's interesting to learn about the marine chronometer and why it's gimbaled and all of that sort of stuff. But it's much more interesting to then go, well, the reason they needed this, it was a race against time because the world like it really puts those little mechanical things into a much more interesting kind of concept for me, which is again brand agnostic in some ways, but it does give you a more rounded sort of thing. And as a side benefit, it's insulation against hype, right? Because suddenly you don't focus on the 5711. I mean, to pick a hypey watch could be more. Suddenly you go, no, well, I'm more interested in kind of the history of dive watches. And suddenly you're in the world of Jacques Cousteau and you're looking up Blancpains and Doxers and all that. So again, you expand your kind of horizon, and also lets you then find more affordable watches or whatever or niche collecting areas, So yeah, so I tend to like watch books like that where they give me a little bit more context and
And
yeah,
yeah, and at the same time, again, we're going back to well-researched books, where
absolutely.
versus those that were propagated. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Brandon Cunningham, who wrote
Yes.
an excellent book on the marketing in
Mm,
the watch industry. Although it was actually focused on a brand, but it was not
mm.
brand
Great book.
sponsored. Or Keeping Time by Professor O'Malley, where I learned why it was important for industrial America in Industrial
Mm,
Revolution to keep the right time for people to do the right job.
yeah.
But you mentioned something, Roman, and that was that brands that produce scholarship, they are more collectible, and they make it in the scene more. So. Um, are there like histories or brands or makers or innovations that you think they remain undervalued just because they don't have the right books? They never wrote the right books, or people have never written right books for them, or they didn't have the right advocates for them?
Both. I mean, I think what we're seeing is brands that invest in their own heritage tend to do well historically. So if you look at Rolex, they have a good archive. If you look at Patek, they keep a good archive. Even if you look at somebody like Longines, they've invested in archives and making sure that those records are available to collectors. So that does keep the heritage front of mind, and the collectors who are interested, there's always more to research. There are definitely brands out there now who should be better appreciated, more collected, and just better loved that aren't. So if I pick a couple, I don't know, somebody like Baume & Mercier, who I often talk disparagingly on my podcast as a brand that is so much potential but very bland and languishing, now being sold to an Italian, jewelry business, now being spun out of the Richemont Group. But I think Baume & Mercier is a classic example of, they've been kicking around since, I think it's 1830, right? So that's 200 years just about of heritage they could be talking about, making sure people know about, investing. They're not doing any of that. So as a result, Baume & Mercier is kind of, the current product is bland, and the previous product that is very cool. They're all archives, pretty cool. Not a lot of people really know or care about, because there's not really, that information is not readily available. So that's one. I mean, there's one book I think on Baume & Mercier, but it's not really particularly great. Ebel is another brand like that. You're big in the 80s, very popular, now sort of then gone languishing in obscurity. There's no great book on Ebel. There's no, since 1911, I think, from memory. Again, where is the Ebel scholarship? There's a few blogs here and there, but if there was an Ebel book, that might spur a couple of collectors who are looking for a not Rolex, not Cartier, something sporty, maybe something from the 70s, 60s, 50s, whatever. Find a book on Ebel that talks about why people should care about Ebel. It's the why people should care that's missing, right? The same thing happens in the indie space. So you mentioned there's a few books on F. Pigeon. That's very true. I think there's a Jean-Pierre Grosch book, I think, and there's one by Kieran Shaker, The First 10 Years. Really good book. Again, really cool collector mind. Kieran's a great guy, great author, worth checking out. But we can look at like a contemporary of F. Pigeon, let's say somebody like Laurent Ferrier. I would argue Laurent's watches are brilliant. I mean, beautifully made, all that. Again, there's no book on Laurent Ferrier. Laurent doesn't speak English terribly well, that's from what I've heard. There is no charismatic spokesperson to really talk about the brand, promote the brand, make sure that people understand Mr. Ferrier's thoughts, plans, ideas, inspirations, And as a result, I think we can see the F. Pigeon brand and Laurent Ferrier brand, unfortunately, bifurcating in their collector appreciation. Now, what might happen is we might rediscover Laurent Ferrier's watches again, maybe 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line, where Mr. Ferrier may not be with us anymore. But I'm hoping somebody at that brand will invest a little bit into their heritage now, so we have a book or a video series or something to really put Laurent Ferrier into a more renowned sphere. Very similar things have happened. We can look at historical examples of independent watchmakers that have either retired now or gone without a book or a catalogue raisonné or something of their work. And they're languishing in relative obscurity. Somebody like, let's say, George Daniels is very well known. I would argue George Daniels is very well known because he had Roger Smith kind of maintaining George's name in kind of collecting circles, looking after George's watches. They're still producing the anniversary watch, but Roger was really carrying the torch for George's name while forging his own career, which has been hugely beneficial for George Daniels's legacy, I would say. The books are important, and, had Roger Smith not been around, my guess would be we would now remember George as an independent watchmaker, who made some beautiful, incredible pocket watches, 27 of them or something, not many, but who would be better, maybe if not better known, but just as much known for his books. So George would be known as the author of Watchmaking, the author of The Art of Breguet, the Practical Watch Escapement, book on watches, and another book on English and American watches, So George had a literary canon to rest on, as well as the 27 pocket watches that would occasionally pop up for auction but not be seen, right? A contemporary of George Daniels is was Derek Pratt. Incredible watchmaker, right? Now, Derek never made watches under his own name, so Derek made watches with Urban Jurgensen. But again, no book on Derek Pratt. There's a memorial book of kind of lectures by the BHI put out. Tim Treffry was the editor. But that was really the only thing that, if you're new into watchmaking, if you're new to watch collecting, you wouldn't necessarily know Derek Pratt's name. But Derek Pratt was, just as talented, just as skilled, maybe in some areas even better than George, but just never had watches with his own name, never had somebody carry his legacy in the same way. So this is where I think books are helpful, scholarship is helpful, legacy building for those indie brands is really important. And if we look at independent watchmakers who are in action now, there's a whole generation that just slightly preceded the Instagram social media space, which are still underappreciated now. Thomas Prescher, Mr. Strehler, Andrea Strehler, Vincent Calabresi, Sven Anderson. I just noticed they published a book last year. So, Paul Gerber, Ludwig Oechsli, and there's a bunch of these incredible makers who are just coming towards their retirement age. They're not as well known as I would argue they should be, because there's a bunch of articles on Purist Pro and Time Zone, maybe if you can find them. But there isn't kind of a book that you can go to, Watchprint or whoever your supplier of horological books is and go, oh, I want to get the catalogue raisonné of Mr. Gerber's work. Oh, wow, look at Thomas Prescher, 1981 to 2020. Like, wow, look at that. So I think, this is where scholarship books become really important in my mind, and I'm really passionate about that.
And I can't agree more. I would dive even deeper on this. I think that there should be, in my opinion, humble opinion, I'm not an expert on this, but I think there should also be books about the suppliers.
I agree. Totally agree. So
and that are so focused on their trade, on their skills, and that is generational. We don't know them, but
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, like somebody like Donze Cadran making enamel dials.
Yeah.
5, 6, whatever, 7 generations. I mean, how amazing would that be if you could look at a catalogue raisonné of Donze Cadran the first 200 years,
Yep.
Because you hope there'll be another 200 after. So, it'd be amazing. Or read a book about that case maker if you can find one. And that always drives me crazy now with, last year, Jean-Pierre Hagman, who was this
Yeah.
incredible case maker, passed away.
Yes.
So again, where is the Jean-Pierre Hagman catalog resonate now, of
True.
just going old to new, all his designs, talk to the family if there's family, talk to the people he's worked with, talk to Rezepi at Akrivia he worked with last, find all the people, find somebody at Patek who's still there, who worked with Mr. Hugman on the minute repeater case. Like, that would be a really good way to acknowledge Mr. Hugman's contribution to horology. But,
Can't agree more.
not just seeing Patek Philippe pictures of Patek Philippe cases with the JHP case mark on it. I mean, that's nice and that inflates auction prices. That's all very nice. But that's not what I would love to see is somebody doing the research, and maybe it should be Patek or the FHH, the Federation of Horology. I don't know. They exist for something, beyond GPHD once a year or something, like invest, like actually promote the makers, the people who make, whether it's suppliers, case makers, strap makers, I don't know. Craftspeople are always fascinating, and particularly
Definitely.
important ones. I'd love to see more scholarship into that, because that in a way will also then keep Mr. Hugman, if we're talking about Mr. Hugman, his watches will become more relevant, more collectible. They'll bring more value, because there'll be a supporting scholarship underpinning just the case mark on the case with a little auction blurb. My opinion only.
And my next question was about, do you think we're just writing better knowledge books, or just more horological content and books? But I guess in what we talked
Sure.
lastly, if these things are produced, that means a much better knowledge on horology rather than just more content about. I read that Napoleon Bonaparte was a custodian, or was a patron of Breguet in at least 12 books or 20 books
Sure.
or whatever, and this kind of thing. Would you agree with that?
Sure. Yes. So I think, I mean, there is two types of watch content. It's a bit like whether it's online news sites like, I don't know, Hodinkee or One, there's really two type of content. There is the everyday, this was released today, press release type content. Well, that's like that's like newspapers. That stuff dates immediately. As soon as you go, oh look, this was launched. And then you read it once, that article can just disappear into the ether and, might never be seen again. So that stuff is almost disposable, versus some stuff that is produced that has sort of evergreen. Like I would argue the stuff that you are doing with Watches and Politics, it's evergreen, right? Because you're thoughtful about, like, the content you're producing is irrelevant of the year that it's made, but it's trying to add information or scholarship to it. The stuff that, I don't know, let's say John Reardon is doing with collectability with his podcasts and with the books that John has written, and John and Tanya do a brilliant job. Their stuff, they're adding to the knowledge, the pyramid of knowledge that we're all building. That stuff will always remain. A lot of the hypey, this is now with a blue dial, this is like that's just everyday, that's just news. That will disappear. So as long as we're still in the midst of just producing disposable content, somebody is still producing something of lasting value, whether it's in book, video, that will, I hope that we continue to do that. Because the new stuff, I don't care about.
I certainly hope so. But if a historian will write a book, let's imagine, and it will be titled Roman and the Independent Preservation of Horological Knowledge, what would you hope that it captures?
Oh God, that's a very humbling question, because I think people are often bad judges of their own worth or contribution. So I don't know. It's a very kind question. It's a very humbling question. I mean, I think without sounding too kind of, conceited about it, but what I hope they write, he tried to do some good, or he tried to contribute. That's all, he tried to contribute. I think I will be happy with that. That's enough. That's enough.
All right. Well, uh, I I have a feeling that we could speak until the morning,
For sure.
and there would still be topics that would remain untalked about. But uh, let me get a word from you that we can have another podcast sometime soon. And for the end, I wanted to ask you a question about what is a collector according to you.
Mm. Thank you. So yes, I would love to. I would be honoured to if I didn't bore you or the listeners with my
No.
ramblers. It would be my pleasure. What is a collector is a really good question. So I think a collector is a pathological accumulator of objects or knowledge. And I say pathological because it's a mania that cannot be contained.
Okay.
Right. So it's because I think of myself as a collector with a small c, knowing that this madness will never be finished. There is always another book to hunt. There is always another watch to see. And if my interest wanes in watches, my eyes starts looking at pocket watches. And I know I start looking at pocket watches and suddenly I'm looking at clocks and I'm reading clock books and I'm sort of doing that. Oh, cool. There's a marine chronometer popped up. Oh, cool. I haven't known about this maker. So I think a collector, whether it's objects or information, there is an itch that will never get scratched, So I think I will, to my dying day, I will be thinking about the next thing that I should put a bid in or I should try to get. I'm sure that's be my, so collection is always n+1, one being whatever your
The
eyes
next
looking.
one.
So, yeah. So, but it's a fun thing as long as so that's, I've always thought, if I can, with the Fifth Reese podcast stuff, if I can help add something to this hobby that gives me so much joy and allows me to meet so many wonderful people, that's always been the game. Add something positive to this thing.
Well, Roman, continue doing what you do because you do a great job in scratching that itch for a lot of people like us. But as you said, there is always the +1. It was such a pleasure talking to you. I don't even know how time passed so fast, but I hope we can talk again and delve into some topics that we weren't able to touch here. I appreciate you. I appreciate your work, and I appreciate your support in this educational journey that I embarked in. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Eddie. My pleasure, and keep doing what you're doing. Love your work. Thank you again.
Appreciate it.